You're wasting my time. Trump snapped, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. The room went dead silent. J.D. Vance hadn't even sat down yet, still standing by the door with his hand on the knob. He knew that was coming. The impatience, the contempt, but it stung all the same. For a moment, he almost turned around and walked out. He could have. It would have been so easy, so much simpler. J.D. had been trying to pull the Republican base together for months now, meeting with donors, strategizing, and working with his connections. But he hadn't signed up for this. He hadn't signed up for dealing with the sharp edges of Donald Trump in this cold, judgmental way. Mr. President, J.D. started, his voice steady, calm, the kind of voice that had earned him respect among the thinkers, the writers, and the strategists. But Trump wasn't having it. You think you can do this? You really think you can turn it all around? Trump interrupted, leaning back in his chair and raising an eyebrow, his arms spread out as if daring J.D. to explain himself. The rest of the room, senior advisors, aides, and a few of Trump's loyalists, watched with bated breath, sensing the first sparks of a battle. J.D. exhaled slowly. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being underestimated, not like this. Sure, he was no political veteran, no flashy billionaire, but he had his own credibility, built over years of writing about the brokenness of the American dream and the working class. I'm not here to turn it around on my own, he said, his tone firm yet measured. I'm here because the base needs something real. They're not going to buy empty promises anymore. They want someone who gets it, who understands what they're going through. Trump scoffed, cutting him off. You think they care about what they're going through? They want someone who fights, who doesn't back down. His voice dropped to a growl. You think I don't know that? The room held its breath again. J.D. could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he couldn't show it. Not now. J.D. took a step closer to the table, all eyes still on him. He could feel the weight of the moment, the cameras, the pressure, the expectations. It was suffocating. Fighting isn't enough if you don't know what you're fighting for, he said quietly. You can't just scream, America first, and expect everyone to follow. They want something that feels like a future, not a past that keeps slipping away. Trump's face hardened, his gaze narrowing. For a split second, J.D. thought he might blow up right there, but instead, there was a long pause. Trump's lips tightened, and the silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Trump broke it, his voice low and calculated. So, what are you going to do about it? What's your plan, Vance? What's your big idea? J.D. didn't flinch. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, staring directly into Trump's eyes. The plan isn't to sell more anger, sir. The plan is to find what people actually need. The forgotten ones, the working people who've been left behind. The ones who are angry, yes, but also the ones who are just tired. They want something that makes them believe their country is still worth fighting for. His words were raw, honest, more honest than anything J.D. had said in the last few months. It wasn't just strategy anymore. It was about finding meaning. And J.D. didn't know how to do that. But he sure as hell wasn't going to walk away from trying. There was another tense silence. No one moved. No one said a word. Trump studied him for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he nodded slowly, as if digesting J.D.'s words. You're going to need a lot more than words, Vance, Trump said quietly, leaning back in his chair. But I'll give you a shot. Just don't screw it up. The room exhaled. J.D. stood there for a moment, unsure whether he had just won or been handed an impossible task. But one thing was clear. Things were about to get a lot more complicated. The following days felt like a blur to J.D. The whirlwind of strategy meetings, phone calls with donors, and endless discussions about messaging never seemed to stop. But every time he found himself alone, just for a moment, he couldn't shake that initial encounter with Trump, the blunt dismissal, the harsh words, the cold silence. The weight of it pressed on him. What had he gotten himself into? It wasn't just Trump's challenge that had J.D. rattled. It was the deeper reality of what he was trying to do. When J.D. first stepped into the world of politics, back when his memoir hit the shelves, it had been about trying to understand America's working-class struggle, not about pushing someone's agenda or twisting words to make them palatable for the masses. But now, he was in the middle of a battle he wasn't sure he understood yet. How do you convince millions of people to believe again in a system they thought had abandoned them? How do you give them hope when so many of them felt betrayed? That night, JD found himself in a small, dimly lit room in the West Wing. He was sitting at a table with a few of Trump's closest allies, people who had been by his side for years. The tension in the room was palpable. The group had been talking about voter turnout in the swing states, numbers that weren't looking great, and how JD was supposed to turn it around with his grassroots message. The idea was simple on paper. Reconnect with the forgotten people, the ones who had voted for Trump but felt left behind in the wake of the administration's chaos. But in practice, it was a mess. "You're asking us to sell them hope," one of the advisors, a hard-nosed woman named Karen, said with a sharp edge in her voice. "Hope doesn't win elections. Anger does. That's how we won last time. That's how we get them fired up. They want someone to take it to the establishment, not another guy preaching about what's wrong." JD set his glass down carefully. He wasn't much of a drinker, but the bourbon in front of him was the only thing that helped dull the edge of the conversation. He had to fight the urge to roll his eyes. They were all talking like it was 2016 again, like anger was the only thing that had ever worked. But JD had learned something different since then. He'd seen it firsthand. Anger only got you so far before it burned out. And then what was left? Nothing. But how could he say that to these people without alienating them entirely? They were the ones who had the power, who held the influence, and JD was just an outsider. "I get it," JD said, keeping his voice steady. "I know what you're all thinking, but I've spent months talking to the people who are actually going to make a difference. It's not just about shouting louder than the other side. It's about giving them something real. They've had enough of the lies, the empty promises. They want something they can trust, something that feels like change. We can't just keep peddling the same old script and expect it to work. We need to show them that we see them, that we understand the struggles they're going through." Karen shot him a look, her expression a mix of disbelief and frustration. "You really think that's going to work? After everything that's happened?" "They're tired, JD. Tired of talking. Tired of hoping. All they want now is results. And that's what we need to deliver." A silence hung in the air for a moment. JD felt a knot form in his stomach. He had no choice but to keep pushing. He couldn't afford to back down now, not when the stakes were this high. "Karen, look at the numbers," JD said, his voice a little sharper now. "We're losing people in the suburbs. We're losing independence. And if you think that's just about anger, you're wrong. There's a deeper shift happening. People are looking for something that goes beyond the noise, something that feels real. We can't win if we keep doing the same thing we've been doing. This is bigger than just fighting back against the Democrats. This is about showing people that we actually understand the challenges they face." Karen crossed her arms over her chest and let out a long breath. JD could see the skepticism in her eyes, but he also saw the flicker of something else, maybe doubt, maybe curiosity. But it was there, and that was enough for him to keep going. "If we want to bring them back, if we want to win, we need a message that cuts through all the bullshit," JD continued, his tone more measured now, like he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "We need to tell people the truth, no more distractions. This isn't about being flashy or about putting on a show. It's about reminding them of what this country was meant to be, about bringing them back into the fold. We can do that, but we have to do it differently." Karen was about to respond when the door opened. Everyone turned to look as Trump himself walked in, his presence filling the room like an electric charge. He didn't look angry, but there was a certain intensity in his eyes, as if he had been stewing over something for hours. He didn't waste any time. "All right, Vance," Trump said, walking over to the table, his gaze sharp. "Tell me again how you plan on winning this thing. What's your pitch? What's your big plan?" JD stood up, feeling his heart race a little. This was it, the moment when everything would come together or fall apart. He looked Trump square in the eye, willing himself to stay calm, to trust his instincts. "I'm not selling hope, Mr. President," JD said. "I'm selling a future where we're not just fighting each other, but working together. We need to build a country that gives people a reason to believe in it again, to believe in themselves. We can't keep pretending that the old way is going to work. We have to change the conversation, and we have to do it now." Trump didn't say anything for a moment. The room was quiet, everyone waiting for his response. Finally, he nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving JD's. "All right, Vance. Show me you can make it happen. But don't screw it up." JD took a deep breath. He wasn't sure if he had just earned Trump's trust or if he had just been handed an impossible task. But either way, there was no turning back now. The next few weeks felt like a storm, each day more chaotic than the last. JD had barely any time to think. Every hour filled with strategy sessions, conference calls, and more speeches than he'd ever imagined he'd give. But there was something he couldn't shake. Every time he tried to push the narrative of hope, of unity, he felt like he was met with resistance. It wasn't just Trump or Karen anymore. It was everyone. The donors, the advisors, the political machine that had been running things for years, all of them pushing for the same thing: anger, fear, conflict. The things that had once ignited the movement were now their only fuel, and JD was beginning to wonder if he was the only one who saw how much damage it was doing. One morning, he found himself sitting alone in the back corner of a small diner in Cleveland, sipping coffee and scrolling through social media. The responses to his latest speech were flooding in. Some were supportive, but many were scathing. Weak. Not what we need. Vance is a sellout. The word stung, but JD had braced himself for it. What troubled him more was the realization that people didn't want what he was offering. They didn't want the future. They wanted a battle, a fight they could rally behind. The cold reality of the situation hit him harder than anything Trump had said. Maybe this wasn't about convincing anyone. Maybe this was just about playing a game he didn't even understand. JD pushed the phone aside, his hands shaking slightly. It wasn't the criticism that bothered him, it was the doubt. Doubt about his place in all of this. Doubt about what he was trying to achieve. He knew the stakes were higher than ever, and the pressure was overwhelming, but every decision felt like a gamble, a step into the unknown. Maybe he wasn't the right person for this job. Maybe the game had already been rigged before he ever showed up. Mind if I sit here? A voice interrupted his thoughts. JD looked up to see a man in his mid-40s standing at the end of the booth, holding a tray of food in one hand, his other hand adjusting the baseball cap on his head. There was something unassuming about him, the kind of guy you wouldn't notice in a crowd unless he was the one you needed. He was dressed casually, nothing special, just an average guy. JD didn't recognize him at first, but the man smiled and slid into the seat across from him. "Yeah, sure," JD muttered, not really looking up. He was too tired to care about small talk. The man didn't seem bothered by the lack of enthusiasm. Instead, he placed his food in front of him and folded his hands on the table. "You're JD Vance, right?" the man asked, his voice carrying a quiet familiarity. "Yeah, I am. Can I help you with something?" JD replied, trying to sound polite, but his mind was still racing, processing the countless thoughts that kept him awake at night. "I just wanted to say thanks for what you're trying to do," the man said, leaning back slightly. "I've been following your speeches, what you're saying about bringing people together. It's not easy, I know, but there's something you said the other day, about people needing to feel like they're not forgotten. That stuck with me." JD frowned, unsure of what to make of the comment. He wasn't used to being approached like this, especially not by people who seemed so genuine. He'd heard plenty of praise in the political world, but it never felt real. It always felt like people were just trying to get something from him. This was different. "I'm glad it resonated with you," JD said, the weariness in his voice showing more than he intended. "But honestly, I'm not sure what I'm doing here anymore. I thought I could make a difference, but I keep hitting roadblocks. Everywhere I turn, people just want more of the same. More fighting, more division." The man paused for a moment, his eyes thoughtful, before he spoke again. "I get it. I'm not the guy who's going to sit here and tell you what to do. But here's the thing you've got to remember. It's not about what the people in charge want. It's about what the people need. You can't just keep fighting the same fight the same way. You got to find a new way to win. And sometimes that means giving people something they can actually believe in." JD looked at the man, really looked at him for the first time. There was no agenda in his eyes, no hidden message. It was almost as if he was just speaking from the heart. "You're right. But how do I do that?" JD asked, his voice a little softer now. "How do I convince a nation to turn away from what they've been fed for so long? They're angry, they're scared, and they don't trust anyone who doesn't give them what they want to hear." The man shook his head. "You can't change everything in one speech, JD. People aren't looking for someone to fix them. They're looking for someone to remind them who they really are. They don't need another politician, another loudmouth. They need someone who listens, someone who sees them. And if you can do that, if you can make them believe they're worth something, then maybe, just maybe, you'll be able to get them to follow you." JD leaned back in his chair, his mind turning over the stranger's words. It was the kind of advice he hadn't expected, the kind of advice that didn't come from strategy meetings or focus groups. It wasn't about polls or approval ratings or how many speeches you could give. It was about people, real people, who just wanted to feel seen, heard, and understood. JD wasn't sure if he was the one to lead them there, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that if he didn't try, then he was just as guilty as everyone else who'd let them down. Well, thanks for the advice, JD said finally, still not fully understanding why the man was sitting there with him. But what do you think? Do you think I have a shot at making this work? The man smiled, a small but knowing smile. You don't need a shot, JD. You just need to keep trying. People will follow someone who gives them a reason to believe again. Just don't forget why you started this in the first place. And if you can do that, you'll be all right. JD watched the man get up and walk out of the diner, disappearing into the world outside. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the empty seat across from him. The advice felt simple, but in that simplicity, there was something profound. JD didn't know if he was the right person to turn things around, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like maybe he could be. And that, he realized, was the beginning of something he hadn't seen coming. The next few days were a blur of speeches, press conferences, and hours spent in closed-door meetings. JD had listened to more focus group results than he cared to remember, all telling him the same thing. People were angry, people wanted change, and most of all, they wanted someone who wasn't afraid to fight. But JD knew something that everyone else seemed to have missed. Anger didn't fix anything. Anger didn't rebuild communities. And more than anything, anger was starting to wear thin. He was certain of it now. People were exhausted. But no one in the room seemed to hear it. Not the political strategists, not the campaign donors, and certainly not Trump, who had spent the last week sending JD snippets of speeches, none of them focusing on anything other than stirring up fear, stirring up hate. They thought they could win by playing on people's worst instincts, and JD couldn't stomach it anymore. That afternoon, JD found himself at a rally in Pennsylvania, standing behind a podium with a crowd of thousands in front of him. The cameras flashed, the noise was deafening, and the air was thick with energy. JD felt the weight of it, the weight of expectation, the pressure to say the right thing, the fear that this might be his last chance to make an impact. He hadn't been able to shake the conversation with the man in the diner, the simple, quiet advice that had stayed with him longer than anything he'd heard in the halls of power. He wasn't sure if it was possible to change everything with just words, but he had to try. He owed it to the people who were waiting for something real. He owed it to himself. He stepped up to the microphone, looking out at the crowd, feeling the tension rise in his chest. The shouting, the chants, they were all ready for him to give them what they wanted. But JD wasn't sure if he could do that anymore. He had prepared the speech, he had followed the strategy, but in that moment, as he stood in front of that sea of faces, he couldn't bring himself to play the game. The crowd was screaming, chanting his name, but there was a hollowness to it. They didn't care about the message. They cared about the fight, the spectacle. They cared about a leader who would shout back at the world, who would fight the establishment with every breath in his body. But JD wasn't sure if that was enough anymore. He paused for a long moment, staring into the crowd, feeling every single set of eyes on him. He could almost hear the questions that would come after. Was he losing his nerve? Had he given up? What was he even doing here? The weight of it almost made him turn away, almost made him step down and leave the stage. But then he remembered the diner, the man who had spoken to him so plainly. People didn't need anger. They needed something different, something they could believe in. He knew that, even if no one else did. "Thank you," JD finally said, his voice breaking the silence. The crowd didn't cheer immediately. They weren't sure where this was going. JD could feel the shift in the air. "Thank you for being here. Thank you for your passion. But I'm going to be honest with you. I don't want to talk about the fight today. I don't want to talk about who we're against. I don't want to talk about enemies, or divisions, or blame." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, some puzzled, some annoyed. They weren't expecting this. But JD didn't care. He had come to this rally for one reason: to speak the truth, the way he felt it. He couldn't keep pretending that what was happening was the right way forward. He couldn't keep pretending that all they needed was someone to keep fighting for the sake of fighting. "I want to talk about the future," JD said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I want to talk about what we can build together. Not as Republicans, not as Democrats, but as Americans. I know we've been through a lot. I know there's pain. I know there's frustration. And I know some of you feel like the world is against you. But if we keep fighting each other, if we keep tearing each other down, nothing will ever change. We'll just be stuck in this cycle forever. And we can't afford that. Not anymore. The crowd went silent. The energy had shifted from anger to something else, something quieter, something more uncertain. JD could feel the skepticism in the air. Some of them were waiting for him to turn the corner, to return to the usual political speech, the one they were used to hearing. But JD wasn't done yet. We need a future that's built on something better. A future where we stop blaming each other for everything that's gone wrong, and instead, we start taking responsibility. Responsibility for our communities, for our children, for our country. We need to stop looking for enemies and start looking for solutions. We need to come together, not just to fight, but to build something that we can all be proud of. And that starts with each of us, each of you, doing the hard work of rebuilding what's broken. He paused, allowing the words to settle. He could see the doubt in their eyes, but he could also see something else, curiosity, the smallest hint of hope. For the first time in weeks, JD felt like he had said something that mattered. Not for the cameras, not for the pollsters, but for the people standing in front of him. He wasn't sure if they were ready to hear it, but he had said it. And that, in itself, felt like progress. Now, I know it's not going to be easy. It's never going to be easy. But if we want to change this country, we have to start by changing the way we think about it. We can't keep playing the same game. We can't keep letting fear and anger guide us. We have to let love and hope and responsibility guide us instead. JD's voice cracked slightly as he finished, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had said it. The crowd was still, the silence almost suffocating. JD stood there, waiting for a reaction. It was a long time before anyone spoke, but when they did, it was a slow clap. At first, it was one person, then another, until the applause grew louder. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't a roar of approval, but it was something. It was a start. As JD stepped off the stage, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He wasn't sure if he had won anyone over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had done something he could live with. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like a puppet. He felt like a person, speaking to other people. And maybe that was all he could do. Maybe that was enough. The days after the rally were harder than JD expected. The applause had faded into distant memory, replaced by the never-ending noise of the political machine. The press loved to twist his words, calling him weak or naive. The strategists seemed to care only about polling data, talking endlessly about how to pivot back to something more acceptable to the base. And Trump, who had promised him the opportunity to speak his mind, was more focused than ever on the fight, on the rhetoric that stirred the base, that rallied them to him. Every conversation felt like a battle he wasn't sure he was winning. He spent late nights in dark rooms with advisors, going over plans and strategy documents that felt less and less like a vision for the future and more like a survival tactic. The people he was supposed to be helping, the ones he had spoken to in that moment of truth at the rally, felt further away than ever. That evening, JD sat in a quiet corner of the White House, sipping coffee as he stared at the papers on the desk in front of him. His phone buzzed once, twice, messages, reminders, demands from his team, from Trump's team. The walls felt like they were closing in. He couldn't escape the constant feeling that he was just one misstep away from being discarded, like so many others before him. But as much as he wanted to ignore the noise and retreat into his own head, he knew there was no turning back now. He had made a choice. The speech, the rally, it wasn't just about winning votes. It was about trying to change the conversation, trying to make people believe that something else was possible. And now, more than ever, JD could feel that weight on his shoulders. He couldn't walk away from it. A knock on the door broke him from his thoughts. He looked up, startled, as a figure entered. It was Karen, the same advisor who had argued so fiercely against him at the strategy meeting weeks ago. She wasn't here to share good news. JD could tell that right away. She didn't even sit down, standing there at the door with her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on him. "You know, I never thought I'd say this," Karen began, her voice cool, her expression unreadable. "But I think you might actually be onto something." JD raised an eyebrow, trying not to let the surprise show on his face. "What do you mean?" he asked carefully, not sure if she was being sarcastic or if this was something genuine. Karen sighed and walked further into the room, glancing at the papers scattered on the desk. We've been pushing all this anger, all this division for so long, and frankly, it's starting to wear thin. I've been talking to donors, looking at the numbers, and the truth is, it's not working anymore. Not the way we thought it would. She paused for a moment, her lips tight. I think you're right. The people we're supposed to be reaching aren't interested in more of the same. They want something different. They want to believe in something. JD sat back, processing her words. So what's the catch? He asked, his voice low but steady. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he didn't trust the sudden shift. Karen gave him a wry smile, almost like she was daring him to ask the next question. The catch is that you're going to have to fight for it. You can't just say all the right things and expect it to change. It's not going to happen that way. You're going to have to get your hands dirty. Her eyes narrowed, her voice dropping to something more serious. If you want to actually make this work, you're going to have to step into the ring with Trump and show him that you're not just some idealist who wants to sit around and talk about the future. You're going to have to give him what he wants, without losing yourself in the process. JD felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to shout out in frustration. He had worked for months to find a way out of the cycle of anger and division, and now Karen was telling him he'd have to fight fire with fire. It was the very thing he had been trying to avoid, the very thing he had thought he was better than. But then again, Karen was right about one thing. There was no easy way to change things. There was no way to make everyone happy, and if JD didn't take the fight to Trump and the political machine, they'd steamroll him. He had come too far to back down now. I don't know if I can play it that way, JD said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm not here to fight for power. I'm here to make a difference. Karen leaned forward, her eyes intense. You can't make a difference if you don't have power, JD. You've got the people behind you, but you've got to make the people with power see that they have to follow you. And sometimes, that means making deals with people you don't like. You've got to play the game. You have to use the rules to get what you need, even if it means bending them a little. JD took a deep breath, his mind racing. He hated the idea of compromising his values. But what good were his values if they didn't lead anywhere? What good was trying to stay pure if the country he cared about slipped further into chaos? I'll do what I have to do, JD said, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. He wasn't sure he believed it, but he knew it was the only way forward. The stakes were too high now, but I'm not going to sell my soul for a win. Karen's eyes softened slightly, almost imperceptibly. Good. Just remember, you're not fighting for the future of the party anymore. You're fighting for the future of the country. Don't forget that. She left the room without another word, and JD was left alone with the weight of what she had just said. He hadn't expected her to admit that he was right, but now it seemed like he had to make a choice. The battle ahead was going to be messy. It was going to be hard. But JD understood now, more than ever, that nothing worth fighting for came without a price. And if he wanted to change the course of this country, he was going to have to fight for it in a way he hadn't planned. But at least now, he knew what he was up against.